And we're live. Take it away, Cassie.
Thank you, Patrick. So good afternoon, everyone. So glad that you are joining us for this timely and important conversation. I am Cassie Schwerner, the Senior Vice President of National Partnerships at the Schott Foundation. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to try to keep it as conversational and informal as possible. So one of the ways that you can help do that for Sean and Karan and myself is to stay engaged as we're talking. You can ask questions throughout the hour of our conversation in two different ways. So I'm going to invite you to do one or both. The first way is to just enter your question into the chat box, and then I'll be able to ask the questions. And I am going to pause after each presentation to make sure that we have any time for clarifying questions that you might have for Sean or Karan. And then we definitely will leave time at the end for questions. So the other way to ask a question is to go to Schott's Twitter handle, which is #GrassrootsEd. That's an S after grassroots, GrassrootsEd. And post your questions there on Twitter. And again, I'm going to invite you all to stay connected to these conversations and join us in the National Opportunity to Learn Network. And you can find that network if you're not already signed up. Please join us through our website, www.schottfoundation.org. That's SCHOTT Foundation, all one word, .org. Okay, so with that out of the way, we're going to get started. It's a really great time to have this conversation around building labor community partnerships. I think all of you are probably heartened, as Sean and Karan and I are, to see the recent teacher uprisings and unprecedented level of actions and conversations in this country. Teachers from Oklahoma, West Virginia, Arizona, and beyond are engaging in walkouts and new conversations that put salary at the front, but these are not questions of only salary, and that's what gives me a lot of hope, actually, because I think a lot of these actions that teachers are taking right now really stem from the success of the Chicago Teachers Union in 2012, where salary was one of several issues raised. But really, the teachers, I think, are really trying to use their actions to draw attention to the conditions in our public schools, conditions that have been created by massive underfunding and disinvestment of public funds for public institutions. So, so we're seeing those teacher uprisings, as we are also seeing, of course, unprecedented student action and organizing. Students of color who have been organizing against harmful issues of school climate have been joined by a larger set of students across the country who are elevating issues of gun violence into the context around schools and healthy school cultures. So this is all an exciting time, but I do want to say that this work that we're talking about today and why we're spending so much time on it, both in this conversation but also in this report, is because these relationships are hard. They're hard, they take a lot of work, they ebb and flow, there's successes and victories, but there's also failures and backsliding. And while we're really going to focus on the good news and the power of these relationships, I don't want to seem Pollyanna that this is easy work. And so let me just say that a lot of tough issues get scaffolded into this relationship between unions and community groups. And at the forefront of that, of course, is our legacy and our history and the all too pervasive current manifestations of racism. So I think it's important to call that out. It's racism within US history and the US context, and also within the labor movement. So when you add the other difficult pieces and dimensions on top of that, you scaffold issues of the achievement gap, where we blame students and parents and community members, and then we pit each other, one another against each other. You add that to the divestment of public schools, you add that to attacks on labor and the labor movement and teachers more generally, and then you add the power imbalance that exists between unions and community groups, and the differing amounts of influence, political power, difference in financing, and of course, as I just said, the difference in understanding of the lived experience of racism. So, but that said, we think this is critically important work, and in this report that we're going to talk about today, John Jackson, Schott CEO, really, I'm trying to find my quote here, to quote from John, but I will come back to that. So I'm going to quickly go to introduce Sean right now. Sean Thomas Breitfeld is one of the leaders, the co-director of Building Movement Project, and he joined in 2013. He is a co-director, and prior to joining Building Movement Project, Sean spent a decade at the Center for Community Change, where he developed training programs for grassroots leaders, and he lobbied on a variety of issues, including immigration reform, transportation equity, and anti-poverty programs. So I'm going to turn this to Sean first and foremost to talk about this report that the two organizations, Schott and Movement Building Project, issued, called Keeping Students First. Sean, could you share a little bit about the overall work that you guys do at Movement Building Project, and then go into some of the key findings and overview of the report?
Sure. Thanks so much for that introduction. Really excited to be a part of this conversation. First, I want to acknowledge that I am a public school grad. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I went to Milwaukee Public Schools, and the very first protest that I remember participating in was when my teachers were on strike in elementary school. So I learned about activism. I learned my sort of political and social consciousness from the teachers who, really helped me grow. And so I really think that the story that we're telling through the report about what happened in two cities, Austin, Texas, and St. Paul, Minnesota, where unions established partnerships that are reminiscent of what happened in Chicago in terms of the alignment between labor and community groups. And as an organization, Building Movement Project, we thought it was important to partner with the Schott Foundation in identifying and telling that story, because we have a variety of things that we focus on as a national research organization, but one of them is how organizations collaborate and work together have bigger impact than they could on their own. And especially when organizations are collaborating across lines of difference or differing strategies. And so the alignment and the partnership between teachers unions and community activist groups and students is really important and impactful way that various elements of the progressive social change sector can collaborate to have real impact for our communities. And so to talk a little bit about the report, what it does is it lays out some analysis based on a wide range of interviews that we did. So this is based on qualitative research, but then we also developed some tools that we thought could be useful for labor and community groups to use as a springboard to the kinds of conversations and strategizing that is going to be really important for groups to really work together to both share power, but also to take action together. I have a few caveats that I want to just make about the report itself. So the first is that there's some context setting that is largely based on some of the reading and analysis that we did of the story coming out of Chicago. And it was a really great opportunity for BMP to partner with the Schott Foundation over a year ago when you all hosted a webinar similar to this one with some folks from Chicago, both from the teachers union as well as from community organizations. And I think that story from Chicago has been really inspiring for a lot of us because of what Cassie was saying in terms of the labor union integrating the set of concerns and demands of the community and the students as part of their platform for negotiating around the contract. And so what we saw both in the conversations we had with folks in Chicago, as well as with other national informants, and then with the leaders in both of the cities, which is part of why I feel like it's important to make this caveat, is that, you know, there's a really big power imbalance between teachers' unions and community groups, and we have to recognize that. And because of that power imbalance, it really does require some affirmative support of the union for the partnerships to work out. And so part of the strategy in Chicago was there was a real significant change in the leadership of that union that then paved the way for the union to engage on these community concerns in a different way. And in the cases of the stories that we heard coming out of Austin and out of St. Paul, Minnesota, we heard similar stories of the union leadership having had either a long-standing commitment or there had been a change in union leadership that made this kind of partnership with community groups possible. And so that's not to say that there's nothing that community groups can do to rebalance power dynamics. In fact, there's a really great quote from a leader of an organization in Minnesota, where basically he said that they had to step back from their relationships with unions in order to be able to step up as an equal partner. Basically saying, like, we're not just going to take your money and sort of take our direction from you. We want to be a partner on equal footing. And so that means that we're actually going to have to sort of say no thanks for a while on some of these opportunities to receive some financial support in order for you to come recognize us in a different way and partner with us in a different way. And so it was interesting to see some of those lessons coming through from the interviews that we did both in those two places, Austin and St. Paul, but also that it really did echo some of what we heard from national informants that we talked to before we dug into those two cities.
Great overview, and thanks for that, Sean. I want to ask you a little bit about key lessons. You were getting to some of them that you touched on, and one of the takeaways I had when I read the report in its various drafts, and also just really rang true in the lived experience that we have had at Schott Foundation, watching some of these partnerships both at the national level, but also at the local level, around the real importance around trust building and trust building between union members and community group members, and that sometimes those relationships are really critical to seeing the tough times through from, you know, one challenge to the next. So I wondered if you wanted to say anything more about the importance of trust building as it comes through in the report, or any other lessons that you want to highlight.
Sure. Well, to the point of the reason that building trust is important is because, you know, these kind of partnerships involve moving beyond more transactional engagement with union and community groups. And so the collaboration has to rely on something at a deeper level than just a sort of exchange of activity, right? Like that the community group does something in support of the union, and in exchange the union does something in support of the community and the students. And so part of this is also a recognition that these relationships build over time. And so that requires a level of patience. And part of being patient means staying engaged even when things get difficult.
Right.
And I thought that it was really interesting to hear from folks in these cities that you know, the issues that are often very difficult to discuss and unpack, like school discipline and safety, that to be able to build trust, people need to be able to have honest conversations. And so that those honest conversations may surface some tensions and disagreements. And so the ability to stay in relationship with each other, even when those disagreements are surfacing is a really important practice to develop, and part of what we hoped that the tools that are in the report could help groups stay in those relationships with each other and sort of manage some of those tensions that may surface.
So that's really helpful. And already we've had one question come in for Sean. So I'm going to ask Sean this question, but Karan, be on standby because I think you've got some powerful stories to illustrate some important answers to this question. So the question is, if we can both, and I think you and I have each said this, can we explain what we mean by power imbalance? The viewer is asking who has more power in this relationship. And I think one of the pieces that you touched on is often union groups are in a more privileged position of actually being able to make grants and provide resources to often very underfunded community organizations. And they do it with the best of intentions of really building the power of that group. But it can create a power imbalance about taking directors, as many of us have to do when our funder is a little bit heavy-handed. So there's that imbalance, but there's many others. So I just wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the level of organizations, organization to organization, I think that is most certainly the way that the power imbalance gets sort of realized most clearly and concretely. That the unions have the financial resources and often do end up being essentially the funders of organizing that happens on the ground, which is critical. And without the support of unions, unfortunately, a lot of these organizations that are under-resourced would be even more under-resourced, because unfortunately, private philanthropy is not investing in organizing as a strategy to the extent that they should be. So I just want to put that out there. I think, though, that when we're talking about, like, at a school level, individual groups or individual schools where teachers are coming to the table with parents, there can also be ways, particularly in the kinds of schools and communities that we collectively are most interested in and concerned about, communities where, largely people of color, possibly low-income communities. Those may be communities, and often are communities, where teachers, by virtue of advanced degrees, more stable finances, although we know that teachers are severely underpaid, that they as teachers are at a different level in terms of class and prestige than the parents of their students. And so that then also can create a power imbalance. And then often when we think of teachers and the sort of teacher workforce often being white, and the students and parents being people of color, then we're also talking about a power imbalance as well. So the power imbalance is on multiple levels, and it's sort of like an onion. There's a lot of layers to the power imbalance, but overall it leads to unions having more power and privilege and prestige relative to the community and the community activist groups.
Great. So I want to bring Karan into this conversation. Sean, we're going to come back to more questions about the report as they come in from, remember, there's two ways, the chat box and hashtag grassrootsed on Twitter if you want to ask a question that way. And I keep checking over at Twitter. So please post questions there if you like. So I want to bring Karan into this conversation because Karan has incredible experience negotiating not only the power imbalances that we've been just speaking of, but also the joy and real possibility that comes out of when these partnerships are going well and working the way that I think we want them to. It's very exciting. So let me introduce Karan. Karan Blair is an organizer with 10 years of experience over 10 years of experience working for social change. Karan is one of our co-directors at the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, which is known as AROS. And prior to his tenure at AROS, Karan was the membership director for United Working Families in Chicago. He was also a field director for Raise Illinois, working to raise Illinois' minimum wage, and Illinois Unites for Marriage around securing marriage equality in that state. So Karan has a wealth of experience in organizing and doing so with multi-stakeholders. And so first, Karan, maybe you can give us a little background about Eros, and we're trying to fix this feedback. So a little background on Eros, and then I'd love to have you talk a little bit about what's most exciting in terms of Eros work vis-a-vis community labor partnerships. So first Eros, and then those exciting pieces of work that you get the privilege of hand-holding with. So I'll turn it to you, Karan.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Cassie. And good to see you, Sean. We're competing with who has the best beer, though. So I'm, so some of the stuff you mentioned, Cassie, I will say that everything I have worked on, every campaign I've won has been through the mechanism of coalitions that involved labor and community groups figuring out how to work together. So I'm going to pull on some of that. And Eros, as you mentioned, is a national coalition. And what that means is that we have the three of the largest unions in the country at the table, the NEA, the AFP, SEIU, joined by some of the largest community organizing groups, the Center for Popular Democracy, Journey for Justice, joined by foundations like the Schott Foundation, joined by student groups, the Alliance for Educational Justice, joined by groups that organize clergy in the form of D'Amelio. So what the subject of our conversation today is essentially what Eros is, this really big and powerful national coalition that's figuring out how do we win at scale the schools that all our children deserve. And my particular role at Eros is to lead what we call the BUILD program, right? So this is where we identify and work with coalitions around the country or groups around the country trying to build meaningful and powerful coalitions. And I want to say, and Cassie, you mentioned this, right? There are places, and every person on this call perhaps can think of a place where the ideas and the lessons that we're talking about seem untenable. You can think of that one place, but I will say, and in some rooms people call me the union whisperer, and I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not, but what I will say that in places like Indianapolis and Minnesota and Nashville and Denver and LA and Chicago and PG County and Louisiana and San Diego are some of the places, and Austin and it highlighted in the report, are some of the places where the relationship between labor and community is such that folks are building or in the process of building formations that we think are capable of winning and winning in real and meaningful ways. And so I want to lay those on the table. I spent a ton of time in a bunch of these places helping people engineer how to build relationships, what keeps people at the table, how to identify common issues. And I want to pick up on this notion of trust building, right? Because I want to say that the trust we're building is not between community organizations and labor organizations. We're actually building trust between people, right? And so it is community leaders building trust with union leaders, right? Because these entities are not monoliths, and depending on who you get and when you get them and who wins the election and who leads the community organization, possibilities either stifle or new possibilities emerge. And that's one of the things that we've seen, that where progressive people have taken over the helm of unions, they tend to go exactly in the direction that Sean is talking about. And so we've seen that as part of what is necessary for engineering and keeping coalitions together, right? Union leadership that comes from the rank and file, that comes from strong relationships with community folks, and then they take that into their leadership. And when that has happened, we've seen tremendous growth in terms of reasonable and meaningful labor community partnerships to win the schools all our children deserve.
So Karan, why don't you explain a little bit more about, because you get to sit in two different seats. At one, you're sitting at the national arrows table where there's national community organizing groups and national labor representatives, but then you're also at the local level working on the ground with real campaigns with a different set of players, local community groups and local teachers and union representatives. So maybe just give us a few examples that illustrate this different context in terms of what you're excited about, where you see some real work on the ground, or at the national arrows table where this partnership is actually bearing fruit, that you're starting to see, if not victories, but the kinds of alliances that the report talks about that can lead to the victories that we want for all of our kids.
Yeah, so a couple places that come to mind. So a couple months ago, I spent a few days in Indianapolis and sort of was able to witness the formation or what has become the Indianapolis Arrows Table. And in a church close to downtown, maybe 60 people, right? So union leadership, religious leaders, parents, and a couple or a few students that came together for their monthly coalition meeting. And in that meeting, people then broke out into subcommittees, right, around outreach, around politics, around canvassing, to really drive a plan, right? And so that's one place. In Nashville, a similar formation exists, right? In Racine, where the formation is not yet complete, but like the union leadership is really committed to figuring out how do we build meaningfully with community folks, right? And how do we identify the issues that speak to community members and to the union membership, right? In Milwaukee, right, where they have taken really, really powerful positions on issues like Black Lives Matter, right? In a moment when young people were sort of saying, we want our lives to matter, and the union sort of came out powerfully to say, we stand with you. In the last round of walkouts, right? Even though there are union contracts that limit what educators are able to do, we saw formations where educators said, we will find ways to support young people as they take positions on this serious issue of guns and gun violence in our schools. And in terms of the national moment, so post-Parkland, one of the things, right, and there are some issues that are really complicated for us, how we negotiate, the cops and no cops, but one of the things that emerged was the opportunity for Arrows to launch a national campaign called Books Not Guns. And one of the things that we were able to do was to say, despite or in spite of the ways in which we may approach the question of school discipline differently, and our interests may not always be aligned on what the solution is, could we find a place in this national conversation where parents could say yes, and educators could say yes, and students could say yes, and then take that yes to build something powerful? And that's one thing for me that I've learned about organizing, right, coalitions, is that there are meaningful differences. And if we focus on the ways in which we are different, if we focus on the issues that we don't agree on, sometimes we miss the moment where all of the stakeholders are saying yes to something, and that provides critical impetus for us to move and act together. The other thing I've learned, I spent a ton of time in LA a couple years ago trying to build there, and we got something off the ground, and then sometime later it sort of ebbed, right? So what you said, Cassie, that these things ebb and flow. And so in spite of our desire to have transformational relationships, the players change, right? Who leads a community organization changes, who leads a union changes. And so we have moments where we are in a flow because of the folks and the leadership. And then there are moments when we're out of flow because something has shifted with either the internal priorities or the leadership. And we have to accept that that is part of how these things work. That ebb and flow is part of the DNA of labor community partnership.
If I unmute myself, that would help. you know, you've touched on a number of issues that have actually come in as questions. So I want to raise a few of them to let folks know that we are getting your questions. We think these are important questions. I'm going to raise a few and just see if you want to circle back and add to them. One of the questions that, you know, we're getting, and it always comes up, is around what are any words of wisdom and advice for community groups who are working with union partnerships to try to really push the envelope a little bit more so that unions can be more out front and embrace healthy school climates, and in ways that stops zero tolerance policies and ends, you know, the school to prison pipeline. So this is a hard one, and it's probably, out of all the issues, the one that comes up most often.
Yeah.
So I would be remiss not to mention it on this call. And I wonder if you might want to say a little bit about what we've seen at the Arrows table around restorative justice and opportunities. And then Sean, I'm going to turn it back to you, because I think this issue comes through in the report very loud and clear also. So after Karan speaks to it, I'm going to see if you want to add anything and give any report.
I'm starting out with a laughter. And whenever I talk about this, I often start, I think, with a kind of apology, right? Because there is a way in which that when we talk about guns and cops and armed personnel, that, you know, it is clear that community groups have been at the front of this, and I think their position on this is right. And I think we have to figure out, you know, and then I get to lead a coalition where we're all agreed principally, but sort of how that principle gets played out provides challenges for some of the folks at the table. So I want to own that it is challenging. Where I have seen movement go is, one, again, not lumping together all educators with the leadership of a local union, right? And so recognizing that there are places where even if the union leadership is not right on the issue, that there are everyday rank and file educators who can be organized to stand with us. And that is a critical part of our strategy. Can we identify educators who will raise their hands to say, hey, I'm with you on this thing about guns or cops or armed personnel, and can we find space for them in our work? The second thing is identifying, using those folks as spokespeople, not just to community, but to their own union leadership, right? Because often what we hear is, and because unions are democratic in their own right, what we hear is, well, I'm not sure where the membership is going to be. And so if as community folks and we have issues that may be challenging, how do we elevate as spokespeople within the union, folks who are with us, to say, just so you know, I'm here and I agree with what these community folks are saying. The third thing is actually committing to ongoing dialogue, right? And I know that when issues are critical and when they are close to our hearts, dialogue seems insufficient, and in a way it is, but we know all of us were transformed both through action and because people engage in dialogue over time with us to help us understand the issues in broader ways. And so those are the three things I think I would offer up as ways to sort of continue to organize and move the needle on this question of school discipline.
Yeah, I think those are really important points that you've underscored, and I just want to add one more point. Sean, as I'm going to turn the mic back to you in a second, but you know, I think one of the things that you're also getting at in terms of is I will say, especially white people owning their role in these conversations. And I don't think there's any teacher who goes into the profession, and I come from a long line of family members who are teachers. My sister's a public school second grade teacher. I don't think there's any teacher who goes into the profession saying, I'm going to participate in the school to prison pipeline. But if we as white people don't acknowledge our role, whether implicitly or explicitly, continuing to hold up the systems that reinforce racism every day, we're not going to end that school to prison pipeline. And so what I mean by that is we as white people can and should talk to our white peers about the importance of not being defensive when a community group or parent group says, let's work on implicit bias in our teaching force. That should not be seen as an attack. We all have that. I've been working on issues of fighting racism literally since I can remember being conscious, and I still get it wrong. And I rely on my white colleagues and peers to call me on that and not put the onus on people of color. So there's ways in which we can work with unions and white teachers to not see this as a condemnation of their participation, and certainly not to be calling individual teachers racist. But what is the role that you can play in changing the structures that lead to the school to prison pipeline and really lead to the destroying of young Black lives, especially. So Sean, let me ask you to weigh into this from the report, if there's anything else you want to add. And then I want to turn and ask you a question about, there's some powerful examples about union community partnerships and allied work around immigration and school sanctuary movements, which is another piece of this. So I just want to get to that after you weigh in on the school to prison pipeline.
Sure. So in the St. Paul case study, there's a specific focus on a partnership related to public safety. And so, I think the story about like dialogue leading to action is that in St. Paul schools, they developed a pilot program and they had widespread support from the teachers to implement a restorative practices program in schools. And both parents and community were also supportive of that idea. What I think was interesting as sort of a precursor to that pilot program getting started was that the union recognized some of the capacity that they had through the practice of bargaining to facilitate difficult conversations. It's a shift, right? Like you aren't in a bargaining sort of negotiation dynamic. It is generally oppositional oftentimes. But I think that the union in St. Paul recognized that they had people in union leadership roles who had a particular capacity to facilitate difficult conversations. And so they leveraged that capacity to have community conversations on this issue. And ultimately, that's what led to the pilot program being established and funded, and having more schools apply to be a part of the pilot program than they could accommodate given the funding. So, I think the point around dialogue moving to action is really critical to lift up. And to the extent that the union has the capacity and infrastructure to accelerate that shift from dialogue to action is part of why these kind of partnerships can be really useful and strategic. In terms of the story about immigration, I think that this actually relates to something that Karan said about these partnerships not being about like organization to organization, but the partnerships being about recognizing that we're talking about people. And so in 2012, when DACA was implemented and rolled out, in Austin, there were some people who became teachers because they finally had the opportunity to work. They were documented, right? And so having in that school district, having there be teachers who like really directly understood that program and that process, because it was what enabled them to be in the classroom as instructors, I think was important. It was an important part of why the union then made it possible and made the commitment to also sort of roll out a program around informing and educating their students and families about DACA registration and that whole process. Now, obviously, a lot has changed since the DACA program was rolled out and the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. But so I think what's really important about this story is not just that the schools were used as sites where community could be organized and young people could have access to this resource of the DACA program, but that the training and the relationships that had been developed through that process were then sort of retooled once the administration changed so that people could know their rights and would have a little bit more defense against the kind of really repressive action by ICE in the community. And so again, it's this kind of story of like teachers recognizing their own lived experience and the diversity of the teaching staff really having an important role in the union making that commitment. And then they developed a whole program around it, you know, enabling young people to apply and go through the DACA process, but then they retooled it once they recognized what the threat was when the administration changed. And I think that both adaptability, but also the piece around diversity and lived experience being really important.
So that's great. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask, there are several questions that are coming in. So I'm going to ask a few of them, and Karan and Sean, while I'm asking them, think about where you might want to enter that conversation and help to answer some of them. And then after we do this, I'm going to pause two case studies of St. Paul and Austin that are really very powerful. For a minute before we end. But if you guys have thoughts on that too, of course, jump in. So first, any advice on getting more progressive folks with a racial justice analysis into union leadership? So that's one question. Karan, I think folks would like to know more examples about partnerships at the state level, what those state and local union community partnerships look like. How did they get started? Where can people, what are some of the, again, you've talked about a few cities like Indianapolis and LA. How can people plug in? Sean, another question for you is unions who want to be Okay, can you guys hear me? Those are, and then someone from Florida who was impacted by Parkland asks, how can we have conversations with parents about the desire for school safety and the effects of police on campus for students of color and for students with learning disabilities, which is something we don't talk enough about, so I'm glad that was raised. And then I think there's some questions here that I'm going to group together that are around implicit bias and about ways that we structure the pedagogy of teaching and learning that are not, that we see issues of not nearly enough teachers of color and also curriculum that is not culturally responsive. So how do we sort of tie that together? And then while you're thinking about all those questions, I'm going to ask a question that was for philanthropy. And that question, it seems like maybe my mic is out. I mean, whoops, there I am. Sorry. I don't know what was happening with technology. But a question that came in for philanthropy was about what's philanthropy's role in keeping students first? And I'm not sure who asked that question, but I think it's a really good one and a powerful one. And I'll just add quickly that I don't think philanthropy's track record is so strong on this. What I will say is that we in philanthropy, I think, need to do a better job at taking the lead from folks on the ground. And that's teachers and their unions, but also from parents and young people, especially young people who are in the schools and have a lot to tell us in philanthropy about ways to make their schools better. One of the things I'll point to after, I think trying to be a good listener within the philanthropic sector, Schott Foundation in February issued a report called the Loving Cities Index. And you can find that on our website, or you can go to www.lovingcities.org. And what that work is really trying to do is connect the dots between various institutions like healthcare, immigration policy, finance, jobs, the criminal justice sector, and education, and really try to come full circle with young people and both their living environments as well as their school environments. And how can we create both healthy living and learning environments, not just for young people, but also for teachers and parents. So that's one way that Schott has tried to be responsive as a philanthropic partner in this work. But I definitely think it's a very valid question. I'm glad someone's raised it, and it's certainly worth a lot more explanation. So Karan and Sean, I hope I've given you ample time then to think about ways that you might want to answer some of those questions. So I don't know who wants to jump in first.
Not it. I mean, there's so many. It's hard to know where to start. Karan, do you have one that you want to sort of jump in on?
I'm a let you start, and then I'm a riff off of you. I think.
Oh boy.
Well, Sean, one question that was asked specifically for you is around if you wanted to start building this relationship from the union standpoint, how would you reach out, and what did you learn from your interviews about building those relationships with community organizations? And
gotcha.
So that was posed to Sean. I think, Karan, you probably...
And I can talk to that, yeah.
Yeah, well, so that might actually be an opportunity to talk a little bit about the tools element of the report.
Sure.
Because part of what we were thinking was that it would be useful for organizations, both labor organizations as well as community organizations, to have some exercises to help spark some dialogue, and that it would not just be sort of sitting around in a circle talking about what we think and believe, but having them be a little more structured. And so we worked with a woman named Caroline McAndrews, who did her graduate studies on how to use design and design thinking as a discipline for bringing about social change. And so that helped us, she really helped us in terms of developing some exercises that would help to both build community, but also have dialogues that would be sort of forward-looking and that would build on each other. So the first exercise in the report is about basically what the vision is, this sort of mock-up of a schoolhouse. So that we're tapping people's left and right brains in terms of analyzing what they're seeing as problems that need to be fixed, but then also this creative element of taping or gluing together like the physical walls of a school. And then the second activity or exercise is network mapping, where we really literally put the student at the center of a visual map. And part of the reason for that was that we thought that it's important to sort of think of young people as not just students, but but as real people in a community where there are going to be multiple overlapping systems impacting their lives. And so the activity, the visual mapping activity, is about helping the different stakeholders recognize their impact, but also their interdependence with other folks around the table in terms of what it's going to take to make it possible for our young people to thrive. So those exercises can be a useful starting point for a labor union that wants to start having some deeper partnerships with community activists and community groups in their community.
So Karan, let me invite you to get in on that piece of the conversation as well, because I think you probably have some good advice about those examples?
Yeah, so I think, I think now of my time in LA, and I was in LA, and the labor union, the labor community partnership in LA had seen, better days, maybe up to 4 or 5 years ago. And what we did was, the process was, right, there was some mapping, as Sean talked about, so the union said, who are the folks that we need to really be in partnership with? Then there was some outreach done. So there were some conversations with, hey, we're trying to build this thing or do this thing. Will you come to a meeting to have a conversation? Then you host the first meeting. In that meeting, the conversation was centered around the schools / the communities our students deserve. And then, because it is an organizing meeting, there's a conversation around what stands in the way of us actually having that. So what's wrong? And then there is a facilitated conversation around what could we build if we work together. And so the conversation around coming together is not just around ideology. It's not just because we like each other, but it is because something real is at stake and there is some real opportunity to win, right? I've learned that coalition building is not, and I sometimes struggle with what we mean by transformative, right? But it is not ideological, right? It is not just around principle, but it is around, there is something real at stake. And if we come together and work together and build together, right, there is a hope for a transformed reality that will benefit our constituency, that is labor and community and students. So, and one of the things that happened in that meeting that I found really powerful, and I always talk to Alex Caputo-Pearl, who is the president, new president of the union there, was that there was an apology, that Alex opened up the meeting because there had been these historic challenges, and he said, we apologize. I'm new in this role, but I apologize for the ways in which we have participated in perpetuating some of the racist stuff that you all are talking about. And I'm not blind to that. I see it. And something happened in that meeting where the pile-on that usually happens around how problematic or challenging labor unions can be, when acknowledged by a sympathetic and a leader who actually leans into these conversations, it diffused the tension and provided opportunity for there to be some real conversation. And so I do think that if labor unions are trying to have these conversations, being aware of the history, of the historical context that have produced this moment, and owning your role, your part, and saying, I want to own where we've been complicit. I want to say that we are laying out a path forward and we are inviting you to join with us.
Let me tell a brief story, actually, that is another approach to this work that comes from, really what led to the emergence of AROS, the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools. And I'm going to do that as a starting tactic because we have just a few minutes left. So if you have any last questions for Karan or Sean, please send those into the chat box or the Twitter handle, GrassrootsEd, and hashtag GrassrootsEd. So when one of the unifying moments that really led to the birth of AROS was, and I want to underscore what Karan, you were just saying. So sometimes that relationship and the trust is built through the actual campaign. Mm-hmm. But other times it was our experience in the formation around AROS that there was there was union and community leadership who came together to create something that we called the principles that unite us. And that took a long time of conversation at the local and national level, bringing, again, town hall meetings where people really put on the table all the issues that are the barriers that we talked about, to important, the barriers of trust, but also really the strategies to create the schools that our children deserve. And over many conversations in many different communities, we emerged what became and is known as the principles that unite us. And I think that exercise, and it was many months long exercise involving many people over many geographies that led to this document, The Principles That Unite Us, that if folks are interested, you can go to the EROS website to see the principles that unite us. And if you Google Reclaim Our Schools, you will find the EROS website. What happened was that we led that building of the principles that unite us was then launched at a conference that the teachers unions and Schott held in LA in 2013. And one of the most moving memories from that conference for me was we had all decided we did not want that conference to be about just sort of talk to each other and leave and go home. We wanted it to be a working conference where something concrete was going to come out of it. And we used the time together in LA with students and parents and teachers and unions, and we talked about the principles that unite us, and we ratified them, and we put them up along the room in the hotel ballroom on big poster board. And then the idea was that all of us would go around the room signing on to those principles. And everybody got up, and it was parents and students and teachers and people of all ages and race and ethnicity, and we all signed the documents. And at one point I was taking pictures, and I noticed one of the hotel workers, and we were in a unionized hotel, one of the hotel workers was up, and he was signing his name to the principles that unite us. And it just struck me as such a powerful act of solidarity, because he had been listening for the last 2 days about what we were talking about, and he knew for his kids and his community that the principles were right on. So that was a powerful example. And of course, when we all left the conference in LA, many of us continued to meet, and that gave birth to what's known as EROS. So I just offer that as another way to build trust. And that trust, 5 years later, we still are trying to do that at the national table at EROS. And we, again, have great moments of victory and where the trust is really strong, and then it ebbs and flows, and we have a little crisis and we have to get through that moment. But I think a lot of those times we wouldn't get through it if we didn't have that trust. So we're almost at the end. And I guess I don't see any immediate questions. So maybe I'm going to ask you each just to reflect on any final lessons or thoughts or words of wisdom, which you both have plenty of, to leave us as we go on and do this important work.
So I would say this, and I always remind people of this, that when we talk about building coalitions or doing this work, we're not just, again, talking about that because it's Monday and we have nothing else to do, but we're having this conversation primarily, and the foremost part of this is that there is a lot at stake for our children and for our communities. And so what brings us to the table is, how do we work together? How do we build together? And what formations can we create that make us powerful enough to create promising futures for our children and our communities? And to the extent that we keep that and keep that at the center of our conversation and the work, I think that it behooves us to do that. So thank you.
Yeah, and I want to just echo the point that I think it's very much about, when we talk about keeping students at the center, it's keeping students at the center and thinking of students as whole people. And so when we do that, when we think of students as whole people living in communities that may be supportive of their development, but also facing some environmental challenges that may prevent their ability to thrive, that is what part of what forces schools to think of the school, fixing the school as not being the endpoint, right? That for our children, for our communities to thrive, schools have to be a part of a system that is working, but we also need schools and the leadership of teachers to impact the other systems that are negatively impacting our communities and students. And so that's part of why this partnership is so important, and why it's so exciting and gratifying to see teachers and community members aligned right now and taking action and getting out in the streets to both make some real demands around how we use public dollars, both to have quality schools, but also to have communities be supported. And that involves more than just like the funding for schools and teacher pay. It involves a whole wraparound of other resources. And those are the investments that our young people deserve. And that we as a country can make those investments. We just need to be pushing the powers that be to make different choices than they're currently making.
Absolutely, and I'll just underscore that last point, Sean, that what we're really calling for at the Schott Foundation, and I think our allies and partners around the country who are doing this work and calling for things like wraparound supports and student services, counselors, not cops. A lot of these different demands boil down to figuring out how do we create supports-based education rather than standard-based education. And supports-based education would be education that really puts students first and figures out how to support young people, support their families and their communities, and support the school community, which means their teachers as well. So I want to add just in closing that thank you to the Schott team. We have put the principles that unite us up on Twitter. So if you're following SchottFound.org, the Schott Foundation's Twitter handle, you will see also at hashtag grassrootsed, you'll see the principles that unite us. And again, I wanted to invite you to stay close to our National Opportunity to Learn Network. Again, you can find that at Schott's website, www.schottfoundation.org. And I really want to thank both of you, Sean and Karan. Your leadership in this movement is incredibly powerful and important. And the work that you do on behalf of kids each and every day is certainly noticed by us, and we thank you. So with that, I'm going to close out. I think it's right at 3. And we'll see you in the streets. Take care. Bye, everyone.